The next component we're going to build is the quote component, which is this part of the page. Now, what about the image? Shouldn't we include it in the quote component? No, we shouldn't. Imagine on this website, we're going to have articles about cloud computing. Now, in our articles, we might have quotes from others, but we don't necessarily need to show their photo, right? So a quote should only include some text and the name of the person and potentially the organization, nothing more. Once we build this component, then we'll combine it with an image. We'll put it inside the card and create a testimonial component, okay? So back to our markup. To represent a quote, we can either use the Q element, which is inline, or block quote, which is a block level element. Now I'm going to give this a class like quote. And inside this element, we're going to add a paragraph with some text. Okay. Now back to our style sheet. Let's define a new section, quotes. Here we define a new rule. Now back to our design. The text that we have here is slightly larger than the main body text. It's also darker and italic. So I'm going to set the font size to 3 rams, font style to italic, and color to 5C5577. Now, this is a good opportunity for us to refactor our code and store this color in our palette as the darker version of the body text. Potentially, we can reuse this in the future. So I'm going to cut this value from here. Now on the top, in our color palette, here's the color for the body text. Let's define another color for body darker. Okay. Now back to our new rule. We're going to set the color to color body darker. Good. Let's see what we get after this point. Here's what we get. That looks pretty good. The only problem I see here is the space between lines. Compare this with what we have over here. The lines are closer. So back to our style sheet, we can set the line height to 1.3. Now take a look. That's much better. Now, one thing that is missing here is the quotation marks. In our design mockup, we have the quotation marks before and after the text. I don't want to remember to type this every time we have a quote. I want to use pseudo element selectors to insert these dynamically. So using pseudo element selectors, we can insert content before and after the content of this paragraph element. But first we have to give it a class like quote _, text. Now back to our style sheet, we define a new rule and say quote _, text, before. Here we're going to set the content to open quote. This is a predefined value in HTML. When we save the changes, we get the quotation mark over here. Now we need to add the closing quotation mark over here. So back to our style sheet, quote text, after, we're going to set the content to close quote. Take a look. Great. So we're done with the text. Now we need to add the name of the person. So back to our design mockup, look at this part of the page. Do you see a familiar pattern? Here we have the media pattern. On the left, we have an image or an icon. And on the right, we have a title followed by some text. So we can reuse our media component here. So back to our markup, after the paragraph element, we add a footer. So a footer doesn't necessarily belong to a page. It can be part of a section, an article, a component. It can be part of anything. So in the footer, we're going to add our media component. So let's open up the template for our media component, copy all this code, and then paste it over here. Now let's make the necessary changes. So here's the icon. Currently we are using the snap icon. I'm going to replace this with line. Next, for the title, we're going to type the name of the person. Let's say John Smith. And for the paragraph, we're going to type the name of the company. Let's say ABC Company. Let's see what we get up to this point. Okay, that's not too bad. Now we need to style the name of the person and the company. But how about you pause the video, you do this part of the job. When you're ready, come back, see my solution. So back to our markup, this is where we have the name of the person. I'm going to give this element an extra class like quote author. Now you might be asking why I'm not reusing the media title class. For example, couldn't we go to our style sheet and define a rule like quote, then media title to style the author, we can certainly do that. But the problem with this approach is that what if tomorrow we decide to drop the media component here and restructure this part? So I would prefer to use an independent class for styling the author. So back to our style sheet, let's change the rule to quote author. Now, what property is doing it here? I'm going to set the font size to 3 rems and font weight to 500. Let's see what we get up to this point. All right, here's what we have. The text is italic because we applied the italic style at the parent or at the container level. So for the author, we need to reset the style back to normal. So we set font style to normal. Take a look. Okay, that's better. Now the font that we have here is different from the font that we have in our design mockup. We talked about this earlier. This font we have here is Montserrat, but this is the only place where we have used this font. So I don't want to bring an extra font just to display the name of a person, at least not at this point in time. If we had the design for other pages of this website, then we could see if there are many other places where we are using this font. So for now, I don't want to worry about the difference between this font and what we're currently using. Now, for the company, look at the color. The color we're using here is the same color we have for our headings. But how come this text is very bright? This has to do with opacity. So earlier I told you that we can go to the window menu, then open up the layers. Now look at the opacity of this layer. It's 40%. So back to our markup, let's give this paragraph element a class like quote organization. We could also call it company, it doesn't matter. Now we define a new rule. Here we set the color to the same color we have for our headings, and we set the opacity to 0.4. We should also set the font size to 2 rems and font style to normal. Take a look. Okay, that's pretty close to our design mockup. The only problem is the space between these elements. They're currently a little bit too far apart, and this is coming from the bottom margin of this element. So back to the rule for the author element, I'm going to remove the margin bottom. Good. That's pretty good. Now, one last thing we need to change here is the position of this line. If you compare this with the design mockup, look, this line is currently aligned with the middle of the text. But in our implementation, the line is below the text. How can we position this? Well, there are a few different solutions. The simplest solution is to use relative positioning. So we can position this element relative to itself without affecting other elements. So back to our markup. First, I want to assign our SVG element a separate class like quote line. Again, I want to separate the elements of the quote component from the icons. So back to our style sheet, we define a new rule and say our quote line should be relatively position relative, and we're going to give it a bottom of, let's say, 10 pixels. Here's what we get. That's very close to our design mockup. The last thing that is left here is adjusting the font size for wider screens. So we define a new media query for wider screens and set the font size for quotes to 2 rems. For quote author, we're going to use 2.4 rems. And finally, for organization, we're going to use 1.6 rems. So font size, 1.6 rems. Now, back to the browser. Here's the mobile version and here's the desktop version. Great. So we're done with this component. I will see you in the next lesson.